What might the expert reviewer need to know? What we find on panels, and I think and what we as the receivers of the panel find, is clarity is the first thing. That as a reviewer, you need to be very clear what your role is, and you need to be provided with that clarity. Criteria is the one point that comes up. Clear criteria about what one is doing. The context is particularly important. I was very impressed in a recent exercise by a chairman who took enormous pains to clarify the context, the economic context, the higher education landscape context, the context for the institute, where the institute might sit within a changing higher education landscape. To go to that degree, that degree of thoroughness, really informed, on that occasion, an excellent exercise. I'm conscious today, too, that people are going to engage in very different types of engagement here, both at a very strategic level, institutional level, and also then more down at the domain or program, etc. One of the critical things for the expert panel is the engagement and the preparation of the institute, of the hosting institute, for this review. If you can be assured that there has been reflection, the word reflection was used earlier on, that there has been a rigorous internal critique, then that itself gives confidence. And remember, you're dealing now with, particularly within the HETAC constituency, with very much a maturing situation. But I think the argument might be made that it's not necessarily a matured situation. At the start of this decade, one of the great debates was around this accreditation validation. I'm going to skip very quickly through this slide. I'm not going to delay on it, but it'll be available for people maybe to mine in their own time. I see them here as very much hierarchical, but very distinct and different. You will search the 99 Act, which, as Ian said, is the driver for all of this, and you won't find the word accreditation. You will find validation all over the Act. It's steeped into the legislation. It is, as Peter has quite properly described, it's program-centred. It deals with the approval, with the reapproval. But also there are different degrees of autonomy, and that will be reflected. And you'll see that as panel members as you move around this constituency. You're dealing with very, very different types of institutions. And then one of the things which I don't have time to deal with here is this question of the professional linkage as well, which has made the whole landscape somewhat more complex and indeed more interesting in the last number of years. And I think Peter has very much traced the linkage there, the critical linkage to awards and to the award standard. Just on validation, it's interesting just to look at the two definitions, and I've deliberately veered clear of definitions in this presentation because they're all provided within, for instance, the blue book you have there in assessment and standards. But it's interesting to look at the way the QA look at this and the much more succinct approach that's adopted within our education, within our 99 Qualifications, Education and Training Act. You'll notice they both start with the element of process. But within the Irish situation, it goes and says the awarding body must satisfy itself, that the programme can support the learner, again, the centrality of learner, to attain the standards of the award. So the elements that we've been tracing are all very succinctly within that definition. I don't know if you can read the little bit. It's not added in. I actually found that thing there. One of the great difficulties here for the HETAC is the breadth of the constituency, which I've flagged before. I mentioned this question of provider, and I was interested in when Ian was talking about the ESG, the European Standards and Guidelines, again, which are provided within your pack, where it talked about the central responsibility of the higher education institution. But again, the word there is the provider. And provider under, and these are taken from the Act itself, you'll notice it talks about a person. So if you look across outside when those windows go up there, you'll see artisan housing, beautiful artisan housing. Someone can start off in one of those as a provider and can arrive at the door of the HETAC as a provider. Behind those you will find the DIT and the representatives from DIT here with 20-odd thousand students. That is a provider. What exactly then are you interfacing with? Are you interfacing with the person who provides, who organizes, who procures? This is difficult territory. I've linked this to a separate quotation underneath, which again flags the diversity, the desired diversity within Irish education. We're dealing at the moment, just as an aside, with labour market activation as one of the responses to the downturn, to the recession. But interestingly enough, under the current third generation call, it's very much focused towards the private provider as opposed to the institutional provider. It doesn't exclude the institutional provider, but that gives you difficulties. That gives HETAC difficulties, it seems to me, because there are issues around that. European standards and guidelines have been traced already. They are basically the background to all of this. You'll notice that the language here is very much the positive language, and I've taken it here, enhancing trust and confidence in higher education. This is again about this question of accountability. They use repeatedly that question of substantial compliance. Interesting notion. And again, the point I made earlier on, it's providers as opposed to institutions. And of course, the centrality then falls back on the provider. The learning outcome, our legislation talks about, interesting enough, knowledge, skills, or competence. And there have been many, many papers written on what exactly competence means. And I was interested in Ian's piece, the YouTube piece there, and the different demands that are going to be made of learners in the future. And that's where obviously that question of competence comes in. And I've put that down under, Peter has already referred to the intended learning outcomes, and the importance of those is one of the central pillars of what actually distinguishes a programme. But obviously, the measurable, as opposed to the assessed, piece of a learning outcome reflect both domain-specific, but also that other part, which you can talk about as generic or cognitive or transferable. And that is a growing importance, and particularly with a shifting labour market, that will become more important. The awards based on standards as determined by the Council. There are interrelationships, which, just to mention very briefly, learning outcomes don't stand on their own. They obviously link to the levels. They link to level descriptors, which I see as a separate thing. And they very much give you the guidance. Think of the Dublin descriptors, for instance, to the ECTS credits, and by extension then to the notional workload. Learning and teaching, and then to the assessment strategy, which again, as a sector arising out of the assessment and standards, we're giving increasing attention to. We were fortunate in Athlone, I'm coming towards an end, Chairman, we were fortunate recently to have John Biggs down as part of the Learning Innovation Network, talking about constructive alignment, and indeed beyond that as well. And he would make those arguments, the first few points about the importance of this, and this is reflected within the assessment and standards as well. It's the fourth bullet point is really the critical one here. The aligning of the planned learning activities with the learning outcomes. These are not separate things. Seen as one thing, we're finding that they add a real richness to design, program design. Assessment has been touched upon earlier on. The formative and the summative, we have moved very much as a sector towards the formative assessment, that there is a feedback, that there is a dialogue, that there is a learning from the assessment itself. By extension, then, this moves into criterion reference assessment, which again is very much flagged through the constructive alignment debate, but also within the assessment and standards, and the logical link I've traced following on from then. And again, I would echo Peter's point about the importance of that assessment and standards document.